Okay, great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm Alan Bloomgarden. I'm the Director of Foundation Government Grants at Holyoke Community College and this year's Senior Co-Editor for the International Journal for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement. Welcome to the panel on peer review today. You've already likely found out that we're planning to record today's session, so thank you for your cooperation with that. We'd like to be able to make this available not only to the rest of the membership for the International Association for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement, but to the wider community of community engagement scholars and practitioners. So thank you very much. The quick overview of today's timing is that we'll spend the better part of the next hour or so with our panelists, our distinguished panel of peer reviewers and editors discussing peer review and community engagement. And then after that, we will take some time to respond to questions or comments that you are welcome to put in the chat during the course of our conversation. If you have any questions for the panelists, that will be a place where my colleagues Susan and Morgan will find them and highlight them for discussion after we wrap up the panel at 2 o'clock. So why are we here? The purpose of this panel is really to be demystifying and helping to make processes of peer review more transparent and inclusive in our work. We're also eager to build shared purpose and understandings, to build community and expand knowledge and interest in these processes as they're critical pathways to advancing knowledge and supporting knowledge production and enabling the dissemination of important research findings. We want to do all of this in a particular moment in our society when our fields are and should be committed to examining our approaches to equity, diversity, and inclusion and access. We should be thinking about alignment of our work and revisiting questions and enhancing approaches to inquiry and scholarship in alignment with those values. And then last but not least, we're here today to make it possible for more of you to participate in this process, to recruit you to our peer review processes. Before we introduce our panelists, I'd like to share some acknowledgements and words of thanks. First of all, from the International Association for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement, thanks to the Board of Directors who have supported today's event, and especially to the Administrative Director, Tiana Noble, who's done all of the behind-the-scenes work in marketing, creating outreach, and organizing today's Zoom meeting. I'd like to thank my co-editors, Susan Harris and Morgan Lewing, Susan from the University of Southern California, Morgan from Texas A&M University, Central Texas. And then we're very happy to have been able to organize today's panel in cooperation with 4 other peer-reviewed journals in this field. First, from the Michigan Journal of Community Service Learning, Nicole Springer, who's the editor and Campus Compact's Director of Institutional Capacity Building, and Narija Aravamudan, who's the Director of the Ginsberg Center at the University of Michigan, have collaborated with us today and as well. We've had from the Journal of Community Engagement and Higher Education, Catherine Stemmons-Peterson from Indiana State University. From the Journal of Community Engagement and Scholarship, Drew Pearl from the University of Alabama. And from the Journal of Higher Education Outreach and Engagement, Shannon Brooks from the University of Georgia. So all of us have collaborated here today to offer this event. Our panelists, I am pleased to say, are Dr. Melody Bowden, who's Professor of Writing and Rhetoric at the University of Central Florida, and she's here today in representation of her work as a peer reviewer and contributing to the Michigan Journal. Dr. Kimberly L. King-Jupiter is Professor and Program Coordinator for the doctoral program in Leadership and Policy and Law at Alabama State University. And Dr. King-Jupiter is here today in representation of her work as a peer reviewer with the Journal of Community Engagement and Scholarship. And last but not least, Dr. Paul Matthews is Senior Academic Professional Faculty and the Associate Director of the University of Georgia's Office of Service Learning. And he's here today in representation of his work, both as a peer reviewer and editorial team member at both the Journal of Higher Education Outreach and Engagement and the International Journal for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement. So thanks to all our panelists. I would like to introduce the first topic, really, which is just simply why do peer review? And I will ask them to respond to this initially in the following order. Could we hear from Dr. Bowden, Dr. King-Jupiter, and then Dr. Matthews? And then after that, I think we won't sort of call on you in the Socratic method. We'll just simply allow you to raise your hand and contribute in response to the prompts that come next. So why do peer review, Dr. Bowden?
All right. Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel, and for all of you who are here. This is an important topic that matters to all of us, so I'm excited to be able to talk with you about it. So for me, I think the most valuable part of being involved with peer reviewing is keeping abreast of the latest research. I learned so much from this process. I'm also able to give and pay it forward in important ways, because we all, of course, rely on peer review in our current system to have our work published and to make it the best it can possibly be, to get it out there. And I'll just speak for, especially for the Michigan Journal of Community Service Learning. They have a really unique collaborative model for peer review, and I have benefited a lot from that. It's a really interdisciplinary kind of journal, of course, as are all of these, and they have a process that invites collaboration, direct collaboration between peer reviewers. And so I had a great experience, for example, last summer with a psychology faculty member that we had a great time talking about this research, and it really animated the process in an exciting way. So I'll stop there, because I know other panelists have their thoughts too, and we can circle back if anything else comes up. So thanks.
I think I'm next. First of all, just a correction in title. I'm not a program coordinator. I'm a lovely faculty member, a professor in the doctoral program in educational leadership, policy, and law at Alabama State in Montgomery. The question as to why do peer review? So I'm not sure if you're aware that oftentimes faculty don't feel free to engage in community engaged scholarship until after tenure because of concerns about how to publish and whether or not those publications will be welcome or competitive in peer-reviewed journals. And I mean all peer-reviewed journals. And so as a methodologist, with a specialty in research design, one of the reasons that I conduct or participate in peer review is to strengthen the ways in which community engaged scholarship is structured and communicated. So it's both more rigorous in terms of research design. It positions particularly some of the small programs to yield data that would position them for future grant opportunities. And it generates the type of manuscripts that would be competitive at any journal because of the strength of the research design.
Hey everybody, Paul Matthews here from the University of Georgia. I hope it's as lovely a day where all of y'all are as it is here in Athens, but glad to be here with you. And I guess, yeah, to reiterate, I think that for me, there's kind of three big ways that we can help answer that question of why do peer review, right? One of them is that it's really, really important for providing feedback to authors as well, right? I think all of us who submit things to journals, we don't necessarily like getting the peer feedback in the sense of the aspect where we say, oh, you know, they didn't really get what I was going, or they didn't really, you know, like what I had to say necessarily, or they gave me these corrections. But ultimately, every single time that happens, the final product ends up being better than it was with what I just wrote on my own or with my colleagues. And so it's a way to enhance the overall quality of the work that's being published, is by getting that really, hopefully, well-crafted and well-thought-out perspective from someone who is not part of your own research team. I think the second thing that's already also been mentioned is just the value to the field. And I think we all recognize that peer-reviewed research is the gold standard in terms of what we do in the academic world. And so, but people who aren't part of the editorial process may not always know that it's actually a bit of a sticking point in the whole process of getting things out to publication. And I think, you know, many folks have had the experience where something that you submit, it maybe takes a year before you even get information back from with reviews. And that's not unique to our discipline, but it is a challenge. And that's one of the reasons why I hope, again, if any of y'all who are here on the Zoom or watching the recording, if you haven't signed up to be a peer reviewer, I think one of the messages we'd want to send is, please do, and you can do it, right? But those are important messages, but we need you because this is where the process sometimes bogs down, is if we don't have people who are willing to put in that time and energy and intellectual capacity into doing that review. So that's a real value to our field as a whole, as well as to your own specific disciplines. And then I think the third thing, you know, Melody mentioned the idea of, you know, staying abreast with things, and that's very much true. I also find that it makes me a better writer when I go through that process of reading reading someone else's work in a critical way, and recognizing that there are some things maybe then that I need to change in my own writing to have it be a little bit better from the get-go, or to have it maybe make a little bit more sense to readers. And so I find that there's that sort of intrinsic value as well in terms of helping us be better researchers and better authors of our own research through taking part as reviewers.
Thank you all for those comments. I am going to post the second prompt in the chat, and I'll read it to you first. It's, how did you learn to do peer review for service learning and community engagement, particularly if your primary discipline is another field? And what can reviewers do to be helpful reviewing an article from a different discipline? And I think at this point, just raise your actual hand or a virtual hand, and I'll call on you just to keep traffic moving. Paul.
All right. Yeah. Sorry to be talking a lot, but I guess that's what we're here for as well. So yeah, I mean, my disciplinary background originally was actually foreign language education, so not really anything that relates directly to the work that I'm doing actually right now. But I guess, and so to some extent, it's sort of been lost in the mists of time in terms of how I got started doing. I mean, basically, you get started doing it by doing it, and so you know, I started out doing reviews in teacher education journals that were related on topics related to service learning and community engagement. And then from there kind of just, I guess, became more familiar and more comfortable with it. But I think, you know, one of the things that I would try to reassure people about, if you're not sure on this, is it's totally okay to sign up to be a peer reviewer for our interdisciplinary journals, because all of these ones that we're talking about today are very much cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary journals. And so, you know, there is no one reviewer who is going to be an expert on all those things. And when you sign up to be a reviewer, you're not signing up to review every single article that may get submitted. So one of the things that you have the opportunity to do, I know in our in the IJRSLCE world, and I think in many of the others as well, is you get a chance when you sign up as a reviewer to say, these are the areas of things that I feel like I have enough expertise to review on. And in many cases, if you have a strong disciplinary background, that's actually really helpful, because there are people writing about service learning and community engagement work from that disciplinary perspective. And either you will be able to have the expertise in your discipline, you know, if there's something that's about, let's say, language education or teacher education and service learning, I feel like I certainly have a background to be able to review that effectively. But even if I get asked to review something that is not really in my disciplinary wheelhouse, I mentioned two things on that. One is you can always say no, right? It's totally fine to say, actually, I don't feel like I've got enough expertise to review this particular article, but please keep me in mind for future ones. And the editors will appreciate your response on that, rather than you just not ever responding on that. The other thing is, I think there's actually some value in being a little bit of a naive reviewer in some senses, because a lot of the people that are reading our journals also are not experts in everything that's being published. And so it's important to make sure that the articles that are being published in our field do have broad appeal, and that there are things that people can understand, you know, if they're not in a particular discipline themselves. And so, and likewise, you know, it's really awesome to have people like Dr. King-Jupiter who have real deep expertise in particular methodologies. But even if you don't for a particular article, it's okay in the feedback that you give to say, I'm not an expert in this particular methodology, but you can still assess whether the argumentation makes sense, whether the flow is working, whether the whether things are ground. You know, I'd expect most of y'all on this Zoom call have a fairly good basic understanding of service learning and community engagement best practices, for instance. And so, you know, it doesn't take a huge amount of experience to be able to tell whether the article is being written at the appropriate level for the audience of the journals, assuming that you're a reader of those journals as well. So I'll stop there, but those are kind of my thoughts. I think there's you know, there's always value in reading and responding for things that you're not an expert in, and that's part of how you'll develop that expertise.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Dr. King-Jupiter and then Dr. Bowden.
So that's a good question. And Paul, I was reflecting as you were talking about what I really look for. And I find that when I review, so before coming to IJRSLCE, I'd already reviewed for or been on the editorial board for our major journal in my profession, Comparative Ed Review, and served as a reviewer for some other magazines and major conferences. But I think the real segue for me is as a methodologist and someone who teaches qualitative and qualitative research regularly. It was natural for me to shift over into reviewing for IJRSLCE and to always look at the strength of the methodology. That was essentially the biggest question when I was on faculty at Auburn, because they had just passed amended promotion and tenure to include community engaged scholarship, but you had to demonstrate the impact. And so we were at the time, this was many years ago, at the time, we were just, you know, looking at impact in terms of the numbers of people that were served or pre and post surveys. But I think if you apply a strong research background or research methodology to what we do, and we see what we do in terms of implementation, and then we see the research component as monitoring and evaluation, then we strengthen overall, not just your article, but what's expected in our discipline. So essentially, I came to it from being on editorial boards and having reviewed for other journals. But when I review in community engaged scholarship and scholarship of teaching and learning, I specifically focus on the research design, the overall strength of the methodology.
Thank you.
So similarly, of course, I did quite a lot of serving as a reviewer and editorial roles in my discipline, which is technical communication, English studies, kinds of things, professional writing. And with that lens, that's a lot of what I bring to the review process. In addition to community engaged scholarship is throughout my work as a professional writing specialist as well. I have really brought those together because a lot of the work that I do is service learning and community engaged work within professional writing. So it's a nice blend there. But I am a writing teacher at heart. And so that is honestly the approach that I bring in many cases to reviewing, which means that I am, you know, and that's one reason why I think it was comfortable. I mean, the original question I think was, how did we learn to do this? And I had a lot of fairly explicit instruction in how to provide feedback on writing, which most people, I think, don't get in their graduate training. And so that's something that I really try to help mentor folks with who are new reviewers that I'm working with, is how do you talk about writing? Because writing is very intimate and personal, and it makes people vulnerable to submit their work like that. And so that's something I bring to that process is, how do you approach that? If you are working in another field, I want to echo something that Paul said, which is really assume that you've been asked to review because you're qualified and because your insight is considered useful. If you don't agree that this particular project is a good fit for you, fine, it's, turn it down, that's fine. But the best way to learn how to do it is to go ahead and do it. You are completely empowered to ask for a sample review. Most editors will be happy to provide that. Think about how you learn things and ask for the kind of support that can help you to learn in the way that you learn. This is not necessarily an automatically intuitive process that we know how to do. And we certainly don't always want to, just like with writing instruction, we don't always want to do unto others as we have had done unto us, because that's not always the best way. So know that, you can shape how things are in the future as well.
Very helpful. Thank you. To dig a little bit deeper into some of the themes that have just come up, I'd like to ask you all now to consider how you balance or think about the relationship between constructive versus critical feedback, and how do you approach the review of manuscripts with those kinds of ideas in mind?
I'm happy to kind of pick back up with the writing teacher vibe there.
Sure.
And I would say, I think it's really important to recognize that almost no manuscript has no positive qualities, okay? Even if it's just an idea, it may be something that's been done by others, or maybe a long way to go. But almost all manuscripts that we receive have some kind of value. And I think it's super important to underscore that to start. Then I like to use words like challenge, like challenge the authors, like those kinds of things, to try to have a positive, formative attitude. If something is straight up wrong, which will sometimes happen. I actually had a review, not for this journal, but for another journal I'm on the editorial board for, a few weeks ago. I read an article which just got some things very just factually incorrect, right? And so, all right, you just engage with that, you address that, and you help the author to see that doesn't mean they have no value, but it means that they've got work to do. And you give specific strategies, if you feel qualified to do that, on how they might be able to improve. And so I like to balance, to answer the question about critical versus, and again, you don't have to have 10 negative things to say, right? You really are reviewing it. Some articles are close to ready to go. Some have a lot more work to do, but all of those are okay answers.
Dr. King-Duper.
So let me preface my comments by saying I'm a pragmatic researcher. I kind of see things not as the glass is half full or half empty. If I'm thirsty, it has water in it. And if I need clean dishes, it must be washed. With that said, here's the difference in critical and constructive for me. Critical is that I tell you that something is wrong, but I don't provide a pathway for you to fix it. The greatest challenge I typically see are people who have implemented a really good program and they didn't get it approved by IRB. They didn't collect any data in the process. And then they sat back and they said, what do we have that we can use to publish an article? And for some reason, some people think, I'll just submit it to a community engaged scholarship. That is not us, because we have very clear expectations about the quality of scholarship that's represented in terms of community engagement. But let me say this, the constructive feedback is for me to back end you into a design that allows you to create something from the data you already have so that you can get something from what you did and then remind you next time do an IRB about the same time you get approved for your program or about the same time you start implementing it. And so I have a tendency when I'm giving feedback to identify one or two possible designs and a theoretical framework that would better position them to adopt that design, and then suggest some ways to approach it to strengthen the piece. And so I agree with Melody. People have done incredible communicates work. They've done great jobs in terms of scholarship for teaching and learning. But what they did not do was get an IRB approved. And so if you remember nothing that I say from this panel, about the same time that you get approved or funded for a project, that's about the same time you need to do your human subjects training and submit your IRB.
I would absolutely second that. As on behalf of my editorial colleagues, we've experienced that very challenge. Thank you for putting your finger on that. Paul, anything you want to contribute?
Yeah, several comments, and in addition to the great comments from my peers here. So one of the things that I'd mentioned, just to contextualize where peer review is in this overall process, right? So again, if the goals in general for us is to try to make sure that we as a field are continuing to produce good quality, innovative, interesting work that passes the test of rigor and is really making a contribution to the field. There's a couple of things that happen with that. One is typically the editorial staff will be the first ones who receive those manuscripts, right? So they're already typically looking at them, usually giving them a read through and deciding whether, if it's something that really just does not match the fit of the journal, then doing essentially a bench reject of just saying, thank you for your submission, but this doesn't meet our guidelines. And that could happen if it is really just way off base in terms of things like how long it's supposed to be, or if it's really something that doesn't have anything to do with community engagement and service learning. Occasionally we get submissions that are just, have nothing to do with that. And so those kinds of things typically, unfortunately, don't end up going out to peer reviewers, because that kind of causes frustration for peer reviewers to read something and be like, there's no way this can, there's no way that this can actually see the light of day and so why am I sort of wasting my time being asked to review that? So one of the things I think on the editorial side that happens is that initial curation. And then the other thing that I guess I would mention again is that typically multiple people are being asked to do this peer review, right? And so I think it's worth noting that as a peer reviewer, it's not that you are the one for whom the entire weight of whether this article moves forward or not does not rest on your shoulders, because you're providing recommendations typically back to the editor. So in the sense of the constructive versus critical, some of that is also the editor's job, or the section editor's job, to take the different things that the peer reviewers are saying and to weave them together and to do it in a way that is going to be constructive rather than critical. And so that might be, if it's something that just has possibility but needs additional work, then trying to point out the areas for that. And again, typically the editorial staff is then going to use what the reviewers have said to be able to tell people either this is just a kind of an outright rejection, or it's something that needs to be revised and resubmitted either in a minor or a major way, or that it's ready to go and be accepted. And I guess I would say I almost never have reviewed an article that I've said is an automatic accept. I mean, I think most of our journals probably have, I don't know exactly if we have the data on that, but my sense would be it's probably a 20 to 30% acceptance rate of all the things that come in probably end up seeing the light of day eventually. But those aren't mostly accepted immediately either, right? Those go through, in some cases, multiple rounds. And so I know in the case of the International Journal for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement that we also try to have an intentional developmental perspective to sort of say, if there's something that we feel like is there, we want as the editorial staff and as the reviewers to be nurturing it and giving feedback, as Kimberly says, that's going to be helpful in them figuring out how to move it forward, but that is going to be a back and forth. There's going to be perhaps a revision if there's something there that they can go back and do. So I guess the other thing that I'd say is just kind of my personal process for doing these kinds of reviews is I almost think of it as like a dialogue between myself and the manuscript. So I actually physically, and I'm sure everybody does this differently, but my process is I actually physically print out the thing that I'm reviewing. I read it through, and then as I read it through, I'm sort of having a conversation with it, saying like, okay, you're saying this here. I wonder if you're going to back this up later when I get to that section. Or, I wonder if you've thought about this particular set of other research studies that might inform this work, or if you're going to talk about this, or going back and say, well, actually, I thought from the abstract that you were going in this direction, and now you're going in a different direction, so I'm confused here. And so I sort of write a lot of margin notes and questions and things like that, and then I go back and read things yet again, and then use that to kind of synthesize the information that I'm putting together into what I'm going to actually formally write out in terms of my review. And most, but I don't know if all of our journals also have specific guidelines of what we as reviewers are being asked to comment on. So in some cases, there's like a 1 to 5 scale, or different things for sections, like on evaluating the abstract, on the sort of theoretical rationale for it, the background, the literature review, the methodology, the conclusions, et cetera. So there is some structure there in terms of how we're being asked to do stuff. And so from both a kind of constructive and or critical, I think those two things go together. But again, I guess the big things I would say on that in terms of from the review perspective is that you're going to probably see different things from your own positionality as what other people see, and that's okay. And that's part of the editorial team's job, is to take the 2 or 3 reviews as well as their own read through of the manuscript, and to be able to turn that into cohesive feedback for the authors. So you don't have to be an expert in everything. You don't even have to catch everything that you feel like needs to be caught necessarily. You're also not the copy editor, right? So you don't need to get into the weeds on the really specific mechanisms of how things are written, because typically, especially if they're going to do a revise and resubmit, that's a long way off, and our journals typically have somebody who will actually focus on the copy editing when things get to that stage as well.
Great, thank you. Oh, Kimberly.
So let me say this about the writing, though. A lot of times when people are doing an article on community scholarship, it's one of the first times that they're doing a qualitative research article. And because of that, it's really important to critique, in that situation, I should say, it's really important to critique the article, because again, a lot of us were trained or got our terminal degrees back in the day. And as a result, the paradigms of what constitutes trustworthiness or validity and reliability have changed. And so, and how you write about and the level of vulnerability required if you're doing a qualitative piece, particularly one that you position as a narrative, it's really important to talk about in those cases the style and type of writing, so that the writing is true to the tradition that they're adopting for the research. Otherwise, Paul, I completely agree with you. When you're reviewing, you're not a copy editor, but there is that element of how you write when it comes to certain methodologies that I would probably comment on and give the authors a suggestion or some suggestions about how to approach the writing given the tradition they're relying on.
Very thoughtful, thank you. I jumped the gun and posted the 4th prompt in the chat already, and I'll read it to you. It's: how do you incorporate a commitment to diversity and inclusion in your approach to reviewing work? Perhaps particularly with regard to methods and epistemologies and forms of expression. How do you think of inclusion and equity in that context? Dr. King Jupiter.
I feel like, Paul, like you, I was like, I just finished talking, but I really like this question. Because the issue about diversity and inclusion occurs in terms of publishing at multiple levels. And at the first level, it has to do with the diversity of voices that are represented in the journal. When I started reviewing for CER very early on in my career, the majority of people who were being published in the article were white, male, over the age of 60-ish, and they were people who repeatedly published in that journal. And so adopting a more mentoring approach to publishing or to developing a manuscript is part and parcel of diversity and inclusion in terms of the journal. So I wanted to say that, because if you don't see diversity and inclusion at that level, then the manuscripts or the voices of marginalized groups never even get to the table. And I think the other issue is oftentimes people are they're working with marginalized groups, but they're not capable of the self-critique that identifies the difference between speaking with and speaking for those communities. And so part of the comment would be about positioning their theoretical frameworks differently, so they see themselves and see their research from a more critical perspective.
Thank you.
So
Sorry, go ahead.
I am putting in the chat a link to a document I really want to call everyone's attention to. This document comes out of my discipline, composition studies, writing studies, and it was put together by a number of my colleagues in the field who have come up with just some brilliant ideas and strategies for approaching editorial work and peer review from an anti-racist and an inclusive perspective. And there are 5 kind of key, I'm just popping, this isn't going to look too pretty in here, but I am going to pop it into the chat. This is some key concepts that, and I'd love it if everybody went out when you have a time, grab this link, go out and check it out. It is a living document. It invites feedback and engagement. So looking at citation practices is extremely important when we're talking about diversity and inclusion. Recognize, so I'm just, I'm not going to go through all of these. I know you can read and you can go and look at this later. Making the review process transparent, which this panel is a step toward doing, I think. The idea of talking about this work and the importance of it, really valuing and honoring excuse me, the labor that goes into peer review is extremely important. And then having a diverse group of scholars involved with editing is really important. All of these are clear. But I just think that the most important element to this is being mindful of it and putting it in the front of your head when you are doing research. It's not something that you can add at the end. Attention to diversity and inclusion is something that has to be baked in from the very beginning of your process. And so, and that means the feedback that you give to to the writers, it means the recommendations that you make, it means who is involved as a reviewer, who's involved as an editor, and so forth. So this has to be considered throughout the entire process.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that document. That's really a cool resource, and one that that I'm really glad that you've made available to us here, Melody. I don't have a lot to add on this topic. I guess one of the things that I would echo is what my colleagues are saying, is that this is larger than just a review question, right? So, one of the ways that we help with that is by trying to ensure that the people that are serving as reviewers also have a variety of different backgrounds and experiences, disciplinary homes. I think our field and our journals are also starting to perhaps feel a little bit more internationalized as well. In some cases we are in name, but in other cases we're actually, starting to see more opportunities for publication from scholars from other parts of the world, which also adds an interesting take and a broader, I think, awareness of what we're talking and writing about. So I would certainly, again, say I think part of the challenge with that is not at the micro review level, it's at the macro review level of who's in our reviewer pool. So I would again encourage y'all who are part of this call to consider volunteering for these many great reasons. The other thing I would point out is that you know, some of the DEI aspect of reviewing can be a little bit challenging, because as reviewers, we receive the information in a blinded fashion, right? So we don't typically know what institution people are coming from. We don't know whether it's a single author or a group of authors. We don't know if it's an early career scholar or someone whose work we cite ourselves. And so there is, you know, that's the added aspect of it, right? And I think that intersects with some of the work that the document that Melody just shared as well, right? Is that we need to make sure that we're thinking about what our assumptions are. I mean, we can say that it's a value neutral review, but we have, you know, and we can claim that we're doing things in the name of rigor. But, you know, as Kimberly mentioned, some of those notions of what constitutes rigor and what kind of theoretical methodology have changed, and so, you know, making sure that we're thinking about what our assumptions are and that we're not just kind of defaulting, you know, especially for those of us that are coming from maybe a more traditional positivist research perspective, that we're not just saying that our only perspective is the only correct way to view things. So coming at it with a little bit of humility, but I love the resource here, and hopefully can learn a little bit from looking at that myself too.
And one thing I just want to add really quick, Alan, I'm on the editorial board and have been for about a decade of the University Press of Florida. So it's a book, you know, we have books as well as journals. And serving on that over the years, I have really seen some challenges that can happen in this area, including that books come all the way through the process and then get to the very end, and the editorial board says, wow, this is an edited collection with just pretty much only the usual suspects who are represented as authors in this book. And then it's too late, right? It's too late at that point. Then you just have to go, shucks, we'll do better next time. It's kind of, and so we are really, as a press, working hard to never let it get to that point. And so if you're interested in this topic, and I'll shut up, I know I'm going too far with it, but if you're interested in this topic, go check out the diversity and inclusion statements for presses. This is a hot topic with presses right now, and it's just a fascinating area of conversation. So if you're interested in that, and before you agree to put a book or an article with a publication or a press, you know, it's worth looking into that and seeing what they stand for.
Kimberly.
So let me say this about the presses. On almost every editorial board that I've served, there was an underrepresentation of voice. And if people on those editorial boards don't advocate for inclusion of voices, it doesn't matter how many statements we have, it's the usual suspects. So for JASES, and anyone who's ever done a special issue for a journal knows it may be a labor of love, but it is a breech birth. I actually proposed one, and JASE's first special issue looked at the contributions from HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, MSIs, and tribal institutions. In large part to highlight the work that people do from those communities. Well, if in fact you sit on an editorial board, we oftentimes will take this wait and see, well, if somebody submits something, let's look at it. But it's the assertiveness of going out and identifying scholars who can put together projects that reflect marginalized voices. That's really how we diversify what we see. Because for many people, how to publish in community engaged scholar or journals is a developmental process. And so particularly if you're looking at positivist researchers who at some point I was on a team with a bunch of physicists and they were doing physics education, and the grant required them to do IRB. And we sat in a room and one of the physicists said, "What is an IRB?" I began pearl clutching because I can't imagine having never done a project that required approval for IRB, but for the physicists, they're interested in molecules which technically are not human and therefore not in need of the IRB approval. But my point is that going out and identifying people who are doing good work and mentoring them into developing projects that can be promoted in special issues is one good way to help increase the intersectionality of authors who are represented in the journals.
Thank you all for some very thoughtful and very concrete ways to respond to these challenges in our field. This has been incredibly valuable. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and ask you perhaps to speak to the question of what happens after you finish your review. And just to give you an example, as a reviewer, we've all sort of experienced the experience of making a recommendation on an article, but maybe the editors made a different decision. I may feel not listened to or overlooked. How do you sort of manage the sort of expectations as a reviewer in that process? Paul.
So I'll also kind of put on my editorial team hat a little bit to respond to this. And I'll say, you know, sometimes when we ask people to do a review, for whatever reason, what we get back is actually not a very good review, to be quite honest, right? So you can kind of tell as the editorial side of things, if the reviewer is just kind of dialing it in and didn't really read it carefully and is just doing this to get this off of their plate. So I would say that's not an optimal situation, but unfortunately it does happen. So I think one of the things that we have to think about is, you know, did I actually give this article its due diligence in my review? Because if I get a review back where if I send it out to two different reviewers from the editorial side and one reviewer basically says, yeah, it looks good, I vote for accept. And then the other one has like 5 or 6 different really well thought out things that really should be discussed and revised. You know, as from the editorial side, I'm much more likely to go with the one that's giving me feedback that I can really use in a developmental way with the author rather than just saying, yeah, it looks good. So I would mention that, you know, that's not always the case. The other thing, as mentioned, is that typically we are asking multiple people to review it. And so and the editor or section editor is also reading it and considering it. And so again, depending on kind of our own level as a reviewer of knowledge about the subject. I mean, one of the things that I see in a lot of the things that I review is not that there's anything wrong with the study. You know, the methodology may be fine. They have IRB approval. They've done things, you know, they have conclusions. They write it up in a reasonably decent way. But if it's not making a contribution to the research field, right? I mean, we don't typically need another study about someone's service learning class showing that students learned better when it was service learning, right? We kind of know that. And so even though an author maybe has done a good job of writing that up, it's not a good fit for journals that are wanting to be really publishing things that are more innovative or advancing the field's research things. And so you can have an article that one reviewer might say, you know, this looks great. I don't see any issues with it, but the editor may still say, but in the context of our field right now, this isn't something that actually contributes. And so, you know, maybe then it's something that's more appropriate to go to someone's disciplinary journal where it might be considered more innovative to do community engaged work. And so that's, again, part of the role that sort of there's the interplay between the individual person who is doing a review and then the overall editorial process.
I'll just say quickly, you know, to me, this is the beauty of peer review. People disagree. That's why we have more than one. I used to be on our institutional IRB for many years, and the disagreements among institutional research professionals are vast and complicated. And so this is why, Chat GPT, we hope, will never take the place of us, right? So I think it's just important. To me, I basically don't get a real ego investment in this unless I find that there's something unethical in an article that I think is going to be a problem if it's out there. I'm happy to say, great, I did my thing, you do your thing.
I will add this. Keep a copy of your reviews, because it is not unusual for me to get, if it was a revised resubmit and that's the decision the editor made, for you to get it back. And at that point, the editor is specifically asking you to respond developmentally based on what you said the first time. So don't just, because I have a tendency to just do them going, oh my God, I have a review due, and I just get it in. So I don't really follow it beyond that, but I do know that it's happened more than once that I'll get a review back. And in that case, make sure that you, like I said, you keep the review. Most of them are done electronically. So make sure that you give it some name so that you can find it, and make sure that you can progress what you said to the author the second time.
And some journals require the authors to include a letter responding to the reviews with their revision. And that is my favorite. When they put my comments in there, I'm on the editorial board for the Journal of Faculty Development. And I almost always get a letter back when I get a revise and resubmit, and they have to explain the reasons why they have and haven't addressed any concerns that I raised. And that makes that a lot easier. But I agree, when you get a revise and resubmit, you think, I don't know what sure, I don't know.
And sometimes it's been, a year and a half since you did the first review.
Yes.
Time they turned it around. So,
and heaven forbid you come up with new problems the second time around, so that's a great point.
But let me reiterate, when you do a revised resubmit, as Melody said, you should submit a letter and you should summarize the broad changes that you've made, because most reviewers hopefully are keeping their previous review and are going back. So just a reminder.
Thank you. So we're coming up on 2 o'clock. I'm going to pose the last prompt for the panelists, which is basically, what advice do you have for new reviewers? What kinds of guidance would you give for entering that process and for undertaking reviews?
I would just say, try to walk a middle line. I've worked with brand new reviewers who just graduated from their PhDs and have felt like, especially in the humanities, that their whole job is to critique the heck out of everything and just eviscerate everything they read and explain why things aren't smart. And that is not your job as a reviewer. That is not at all your job. So don't feel the burden of that. Also, people need the feedback, though. If they publish something that has a problem that you could have identified for them, they could be embarrassed. It could affect their career in the future. It's relatively high stakes, the things that we publish. And so that is a responsibility we have as reviewers to tell them the things they need to know. So I would just say, try to walk a middle line, productive, constructive. You don't have to, the editor is the editor. I often am the editor, and so I have to tell the hard news, when I'm working on projects, but your job is to provide your perspective as a peer when you're doing peer review.
So the same approach to reviewing should be your same approach to your research. When you begin a new project, think about it in terms of, how are you going to do the implementation of the project? and chronicling that experience. Moving from that to what broader research questions are you trying to answer that help move the field forward? Those same questions are how I approach a review. That review is also an opportunity for you to learn a little bit more about design and research program implementation. It's an opportunity for you to have a dialogue that oftentimes we're on campuses where people don't really talk about or do communicate scholarship. It's an opportunity for you to engage in a dialogue with that scholar. It's not an opportunity for you to see your research imposed on theirs in such a way that you're hammering some nail you had from, the ghost of publishing gone by. Every opportunity, every time you review, it's an opportunity to mentor and be mentored by the person who constructed the manuscript. And that's essentially why we do service. It also looks really good on your vita for promotion tenure to say that you've been a reviewer. But more importantly, the best way to learn how to publish in a journal is to review for that journal.
Yeah, and I would piggyback a little bit on those great comments. One of the things is the feedback and the time that we're investing as peer reviewers is really a gift to the author, and it's a gift to our overall field. And so you want to, the first thing I would say to new reviewers is just do it, right? So if you're feeling awkward or trepidatious about it, go ahead and jump in, talk with the editors of the journals. You've seen the information is posted in the links and in the chat on how to get in touch with these folks. All of the editors are super nice people. We know all of them. They're all kind and really have best interests of the field and of nurturing new authors and all that kind of stuff. So, and likewise, I think we all understand that bringing in new reviewers is only to the good for our field in terms of increasing the diversity of representation, decreasing the workload on the people who are kind of the workhorse reviewers. So if you volunteer, you will be treasured by them as well. So do that, and then recognize that there is a bit of a time commitment. It's going to take you probably a couple of hours to do a good job with a review. And I would say it is okay to bring in and to be upfront about your own positionality. As we mentioned, if you're not an expert in this topic, if this isn't your theoretical comfort zone, focus your review on the things that you feel like you can say, and bring your disciplinary knowledge to it. Perhaps you have a theory or readings that would really help inform or enhance or help explain a theoretical conundrum that the authors maybe have been struggling with. So you can also help give some pretty good information that will help increase the overall quality. And then, as mentioned, it'll benefit you as a future writer and researcher for those journals, and it'll hopefully be something that continues to increase the overall quality and innovativeness of the work that we're putting out in the field.
Great, thank you so much. So we're right at 2 o'clock, and I do want to make sure that we have time to respond to any questions or comments that participants have. We do have one that I will kick it off, but feel free to type any questions into the chat, and my colleagues will pick them up and we'll turn our attention to them. But the first one was a question about the journals that are represented here today. Can we talk a little bit about what we're looking for, what's in them, what are our specialties, what's the best fit? So I know that there are some colleagues from the other journals here, but I'll begin by talking a little bit about the International Journal for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement. And then hopefully some representatives from the other journals might draw us to their attention, and we can give them some space to talk about theirs as well. So I'm putting in the chat our advice to authors, which lays out 3 things. First of all, what are the expectations for authors who would like to submit? But the other 2 are, what are the types of studies that we're looking for? And they fall into 3 categories. They're research studies, theoretical or conceptual pieces, and research reviews. Research studies may seem fairly straightforward. You've conducted research, you've collected data, and you've analyzed it. Theoretical and conceptual pieces are ones in which we're looking to advance thinking about critical issues in the field. And research reviews are really opportunities to synthesize and take existing research further in light of either of the other two areas, additional research or conceptual frameworks. Our journal, the International Journal for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement, is divided into 5 sections, really 6 when you include book reviews. But the 5 sections are, we have a student outcomes section that includes study of research on service learning and community engagement in K-16. So there's some outside of higher education work that's covered there. We have a section on faculty and institutional issues. A section on community partnerships, which was my pathway to becoming the lead editor. I was that section editor for a number of years. A section on theory and methodology, and a section called international, which we try hard to think about that in a number of different ways, both international service learning projects that come from, predominantly North America, but also elsewhere in the world and travel elsewhere, but also capturing international approaches to service learning and community engagement around the world. And as an international association, we aspire to have more of that kind of work represented in the journal. So that's kind of the general focus for our journal. I wonder whether there are representatives from the others who might wish to provide a few comments or links in the chat about their journals.
I'll jump in and just say from for the Journal of Higher Education Outreach and Engagement, I'm posting in the chat here the about information, but just very briefly, it's not dissimilar in the sense that there are 5 kind of category areas that that this journal focuses on, and so certainly research articles in any methodology that relates in some way to community engagement work, reflective essays, projects with promise, which is early stage community engagement work, and those 3 are all sent out for peer review. And then the book reviews and dissertation overviews, I'm the section editor for the dissertation overview section, and so for that, typically I work back and forth with the authors on who've recently done a thesis or a dissertation, and we don't send it out for peer review because it's already been approved as a dissertation or a thesis, and it's really more working it into a format and explanation that works well in the sort of more constricted setting of those publications. I would also just put out a quick plug, and I'll see if I can find the link to put it in as well, but hopefully many of y'all have seen the great knowledge hub that Diane Dobrenick at Michigan State curates for Campus Compact that has the overall list of disciplinary and interdisciplinary journals that publish community engaged work. And so, and she has a great chart that also talks about the different kinds of submissions that are accepted for those. And so again, y'all can, if you're thinking about being a reviewer, there is a wide world of things to choose from, although I think those of us represented here would love to claim you for our journals for sure.
Thank you. Dr. King Jupiter.
Is Drew on? I don't know that.
I think he had a conflict and he was hoping that another member of the editorial board might be able to speak, and perhaps that's you.
So I've actually been affiliated with JASE's Journal of Community Engaged Scholarship since its inception, and have recently moved from the editorial board to the advisory board, which has a different expectation about reviewing. With that said, what I like about JASE's is it really transcends disciplines. And so you have disciplines that are pulling together health sciences with counseling, psychology, with education, with what have you, and creating programs, implementing them, and looking at the ways in which the community is impacted across different sectors. And so the nice thing about JSIS is it lends itself to projects that are conceptualized to transcend our disciplinary divisions. There's also wonderful opportunities for graduate students to get published. JSIS does a wonderful job of mentoring. And there are also periodically special issues. As I said previously, I've done one before, but there are other special issues. And so I provided the link in the chat box. It's jcs.ua.edu. That takes you to the journal, and you can actually look at the articles that have been published. And as someone who's been involved since its inception, it's one of those affiliations I'm very proud of.
Excellent, thank you. Do we have any colleagues either from the Michigan Journal or from JCEHE?
I'm just popping the 4 authors link from Michigan Journal in the chat. You know, one of the things I like about it, I've published and reviewed for that journal, of course, and I've had a pretty theoretical piece that was very much out of the humanities and critical emotional studies, and also more sort of straight empirical kind of analysis, survey-based kind of stuff. So I really like the range of opportunities there. And it is an extremely, as I said, one of the great things about that review process that they've established in the last few years is this collaborative model where you actually set up a Zoom call with the other reviewer and talk through that process. And I just can't say enough positive. I mean, you know, the only tricky thing, of course, is getting 2 people together, but nothing like a deadline to meet with a colleague to get you to get that review done. I'll tell you that. So very positive experience for me. And that's the info for authors.
Thank you. All right. Any other questions, or do we have somebody who can speak to the Journal of Community Engagement in Higher Education's structure and focus? No, perhaps not. Okay, well, if there are any other questions, I'll just give it a moment. Feel free to type them into the chat. I'll just give you a moment to do that if there's anything else you'd like to ask any participants of our distinguished panel. Okay, I think we are on a Friday at the limits of our week. So let me allow you to claw back some of your time today and say thank you, especially to our distinguished panelists, Paul, Melody, Kimberly. Thank you. Your thoughts on this topic have been invaluable. And I can tell you that it's been incredibly educational for me, not only as an editor, but as somebody that, you know, didn't have the opportunity to understand how any of this worked as a graduate student. And I would hope that those of you who are aspiring authors and published scholars have gotten something valuable out of today. So thank you again. Thanks to the International Association for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement and my colleagues on the all of the journals represented here today. This recording and some of the links will be posted up on the IARSLCE website soon, and we'll probably reach out to those of you who have registered to provide some further links from today's session provided by our panelists and organized by us. So once again, thank you all for today, and have a great weekend. Thank you. Are you able to stop the recording, Susan?
Let me see. Yes.